The Spin-off Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards the
most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on the Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts. Piki mai, kaki mai. I'm Toby Manhire. This is Gone by Lunchtime, 52nd Parliament edition. With me in the pod studio today, Ben Thomas of Exceltium. How are you?
Great.
Annabelle Lee from the Hui. How are you?
I'm very well.
Point of order. Can we get a quorum count in the podcast?
We have more. We also have Don is on the. But
he hasn't been sworn in yet, so he can't vote.
Possibly you're not referring to Don. Are you making reference to Waimihi Rose? Or are you making reference to?
That's fine.
The opening of the Parliament.
Babies are allowed in the spin-off chambers.
Consistent with the theme of generational change in all things political, Waimihi Rose joins us for her second podcast. She is completely out cold, though. I don't think she's going to be making even any snuffly noises. That was Annabelle.
Just poke her.
Just give her a little jab. No,
okay, she's dreaming. We're going to talk first before we get into the new government about Paddles. Paddles, the cat of the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern,
and spin-off contributor Clark Gayford.
Spin-off contributor, republished in the Herald and the Guardian, and appeared in BBC. God knows where else. Paddles, though, outdoes them all for fame, and even in death. And so, Annabelle, you wanted to talk about Paddles?
I just think it's important that, we acknowledge the solemnness of his passing. Nō reire, te rangatira e Paddles e tangi mō te ana te ngākau ki a koe, takoto, oki oki, moi mai rā.
I think Paddles was a girl.
Yeah, that still works. It's good.
Okay.
It's good. Go with that.
It's just when you said his passing. I don't want to be technical. But,
shit.
Anyway, yes, there's that is quite sad, really, and also not the first time on the dangerous roads of Point Chevalier.
No, that's right. I lost my cat Coastie about a week after we moved to Point Chev.
Andrew Little's cat Buddy disappeared when he was the Labour Party leader in 2016. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just noting it.
There's rumours of a political assassination. Have you heard about that?
We're not even going to...
Gareth Morgan is
We're not talking about Gareth Morgan.
No, it's not Gareth Morgan. Did you see the Paula Bennett video yesterday with...
The one in the car?
Paula, Nikki Kay, Maggie Barry...
Wow. Do you remember the classic Toby Manhire?
Amy Adams, all in a car, driving around.
Fuck.
Remember the classic Toby Manhire interview of ACT leader David Seymour, where he talked about the cat he had run over?
I do remember
in
that.
Central Auckland.
We've got a lot of leads here, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to follow them all up. Our investigative
Who is
unit
launching an investigation?
Will be all over this.
An 18-part podcast hosted by Martin Van Benen.
What was it called? Black Paws. The Parliament started. Pretty good start for the Jacinda Ardern-led government with New Zealand First and Coalition and Green alongside. Very decisive, very firm. nipped over to Australia, made clear they were taking that seriously.
Kicking ass and taking names.
And then Parliament returned, and it wasn't such a great day, was it?
Well, I don't know if it was quite as horrendous as the headlines made out. Omni-shambles and catastrophe and omni-shambles, sorry, I said that wrong. Catastrophe and chaos and all the rest of it. But they certainly didn't cover themselves in glory, and I think Chris Hipkins really dropped the ball. And I think, it was one thing for National to try it on, but cool heads should have prevailed, and I feel like instead they panicked and they crumbled, and now they've literally done a deal with the devil over the select committees. Not literally the devil. Not literally the devil. Deal. Unless it is proven that someone from the National Party was involved in the death of Paddles, and then that's arguable. Yeah,
I see what you're getting at.
I mean, in a way, the devil, who presides over the opposition from hell, as National has been dubbed,
yes,
with its heaving 56-person mass spilling forth from the bowels of the earth to hold the government to account as Her Majesty's loyal opposition. So, as Annabelle alluded to, there's a lot of there was some quite fiery reporting about this, sort of omni-shambles.
The 6 o'clock news was all fiasco and fast.
Over the last couple of days, I've been getting New Zealand Herald and One News breaking news alerts.
Normally Mike Hosking has written another opinion piece, haven't they?
Don't even get me started on that.
But these ones are about points of order in the House and quorums, and whenever I swipe on the highly exclamation point inflected updates, I just get taken to a video of Parliament and somebody kind of asking for the Speaker's attention and asking for a count of members.
This is like the kind of
it's always a bit of a letdown.
Of Jacinda Mania.
But so what happened is Trevor Mallard, the very long-serving Labour MP, formerly of Hutt South, who came back specifically, essentially, to be the Speaker.
It was Speaker or nothing for him.
Of the House, and the Speaker is the person who presides over Parliament and kind of keeps order. And
a bit like me in this podcast, in a way.
That's right.
So.
The kind of eminence gris of the proceedings. And National had indicated they would be supporting Trevor Mallard as Speaker. Supposedly Simon Bridges, the shadow leader of the House, the former National Party minister, cast his eye across to where MPs were being sworn in, taking their oath, putting their hand on the Bible or another book of significance, and swearing their allegiance to the Queen. And he noticed that there were a few opposition government MPs missing. And normally you're allowed various members to be away, and you can still cast their votes as
Point of order.
Votes.
Are you about to say that this was done on the hop and that it wasn't premeditated?
Well, that's the National Party narrative, is that they noticed that there were not... Well, it's hard to tell, right? Because initially the reports were that National had noticed Labour didn't have the numbers because they had a few absent MPs who hadn't been sworn in, and so whose votes couldn't be used. And so they didn't have enough numbers to have Trevor Mallard elected. And when National pointed this out to Labour went into a flurry and were forced to sort of make some procedural concessions on various other things that they disagreed with National on in order to get safe passage for Mallard through the House. However, everyone did a bit of a count-up and realised that Labour actually did have enough MPs, 58 in the House. Labour, Greens and New Zealand First did have 58 MPs the whole time. They always had more than the 56 available to the opposition. So both parties now, National then claimed that they had bluffed Labour. They had played a high-risk game of poker and Labour had folded. Labour claimed that they knew that they had enough votes to get Mallard into the Speaker's seat, but they just didn't want a contested vote, and that's why they offered these concessions.
They wanted a consensus, which doesn't wash it all.
No, well, I don't think either of these stories make much sense. I think National looked over, were a bit saw that there were a few people missing, thought they might have a shot, so made a few, fired.
So that's
a few
what
shots.
That's what Simon Ridge has said as much. He said he wouldn't call it a bluff. He wouldn't call it. I'm not sure what his words were, but basically exactly that. They thought, I'm not sure if they've got the numbers because those people haven't been sworn in properly. There are a few missing. Gareth Hughes wasn't there either. I don't know why.
Gareth Hughes was missing. Potter Williams was missing.
And so they kind of they tried it on basically, and really you say it was just a few procedural concessions. It's slightly more than that, in that it's about the number of National Party MPs that will sit on select committees, right?
Well, I mean, we should probably get to that a bit afterwards, because that sort of gets quite convoluted. But I mean, what essentially happened is, on The Wire, you have these police officers talking about how, at every point, you would have to know, I'm on the 3rd floor of this building in this street and I'm facing west. And that's the sort of thing you need to know in the House. You have to know how many numbers you've got at all times. And quite clearly the government didn't have a good grasp on its numbers, and they didn't realise that, who was there and who was missing. And or they did know, and then their confidence got shaken because there has been all this talk about the overpowering sort of size of the opposition, and they got a bit spooked.
I find it hard to believe that Simon Bridges gazed across the House and saw that, there's a couple of Labour MPs. Sure, I think that this is probably something that they had thought about doing and put into play. It was, he's a former Crown prosecutor. He's pretty smart, and I think that they probably had this card up their sleeve and played it perfectly well. And cool heads should have prevailed on Labour's side, and they should have... Firstly, they should have come to Parliament organised, particularly when their leader is vulnerable, as she is grieving the loss of Paddles. And
I think Paddles was still alive then.
No,
I don't think so.
No, Paddles are gone. She still came to work.
I thought that was news from overnight.
Well, it was news from overnight, but Paddles passed into cat heaven yesterday. I don't know exactly what time.
We've got 18 episodes to stretch it out.
We'll get to this sort of in between episodes 6 and 7.
But yeah, I think that it was certainly I think it would have been something they were planning to do. They saw the opportunity and they took advantage of a very fresh Labour government.
So a bluff? You reckon it was a bluff?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and a pretty effective one, given
very effective
apart
one
from that,
with a lot,
it's piss up in a brewery sort of stuff, isn't it? When you're three party government, you've got to be on top of that.
Yeah, and
stuff.
I'm sort of in two minds about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for Labour, because I think, on the good side, they've fired a warning shot really early, and I don't think Hipkins will make the same mistake again, and they'll be pretty sure of their numbers every time they walk into the House now and prepared for anything.
Well, I mean, abacus on his desk.
Yeah, and then on the flip side, it's not a great start to Parliament. Having said that, will most New Zealanders care? Probably not, and it does make National look like bad sports.
Ben?
Yeah, look, I think that Sorry, we just... No.
No, carry on.
We can edit the long silence out, that's fine. Look, I mean, it's not great. You shouldn't... But it's not something that will happen again, in the sense that now that everyone's been sworn in or will be sworn in eventually, you'll have those proxies. So there isn't that sort of situation where you actually have to sort of guess at how many people are physically in the chamber. And so I think this was a sort of pretty unfortunate accident for Labour. And it's not one that actually can be repeated again. And I think it will sort of jolt them into awareness about House procedure.
Can you give us the TLDR on the select committee spots? You mentioned it at the last podcast, and we all started nodding off. But you were right. You were ahead of the curve there, and it matters because why?
So part of the business of Parliament is select committees, and some of those select committees have particular areas of law. So Justice and Electoral Select Committee.
He hasn't put anyone to sleep now. He's woken up Waimea Rose with his discourse on select committee numbers. Sorry, you were saying that.
That's because it's compelling content.
It's great.
The Transport and Industrial Relations Select Committee, the Environment Select Committee, and they consider laws that relate to particular areas. They can do investigations. And membership on select committees is proportional. Membership on all select committees across Parliament is proportional to a party's representation in the House. However, ministers and members of the executive don't tend to sit on those subject area select committees, which means that the government, even though traditionally the government has sort of more MPs than the opposition, once you take those ministers out, sometimes their backbenchers can get a bit stretched if they're asked to sit on too many select committees. And so the more positions that are available on select committees, the more work everyone has to do to kind of cover all of those slots between the 120 MPs, minus the ministers. And what that means is that sometimes it will, depending on how many slots you've got available for select committees for everyone to cover, that will either advantage the opposition in the sense that government backbenchers might be overstretched or might not be able to make meetings, and they'll have scheduling issues, and so you could get a tactical situation where they're outmatched on committees where they would otherwise have a majority.
Yeah.
And that's the only thing that's at issue here. So the government, the Labour in particular, because about half of the Labour MPs are members of the executive, they don't want their backbenchers overworked, running around different select committees, whereas National, if the number was reduced to 96 places in total from 120, which was what was intended in the last Parliament, that would mean...
Before such a big opposition party was envisaged.
National, with 56 MPs, some of its MPs, they said, would not get the chance to sit on select committees.
They'd have nothing to do. They'd be twiddling their thumbs.
That's right.
Yeah.
And they would have to do that in their own offices instead of turning up to select committees to twiddle their thumbs, like a lot of low-ranked backbenchers do sometimes. But and the compromise that was reached during the heat and fury of yesterday's Parliament was that I think 108, 109. So they kind of met in the middle.
Yeah. In a hastily convened scrum over by the opposition benches.
Which
Grant Robertson
and that wasn't voted on. That's a handshake agreement, right? And it's good that we have the kind of Parliament where you actually you can still rely on just shaking the hand of your opponent or your opposition to make these deals, and that we would still expect that to be upheld, and we wouldn't sort of rely on kind of weird procedural kind of finicking.
Do you think Labour could renege on that?
Well, they absolutely could, but I don't think they will, because I don't think Labour will renege on that, even though they could quite easily. And this is the other thing to remember, is that when you command a majority of the House, you basically set Parliament's rules, because our Parliament, we don't have a written constitution. Well, it's written down in different places, but essentially Parliament kind of runs itself. And when you command the majority of the House, like the government does, albeit split up into three parties, you can actually stop the opposition from playing kind of procedural silly buggers. It is possible to filibuster in New Zealand. But it's not the same as the United States, where you can just get up and start reading from Ulysses and hold the floor for 24 hours or something like that, right?
But it is a fine line, isn't it? The point that Annabelle makes is that too much of this sort of stuff, the too much shenanigans and kind of neat stuff, and quickly the opposition starts to look as though it's being disruptive. Already, people in Labour are trying to do that, to say, oh, they're being tricksy. They're trying things on, and if there was much of that filibustery carry on, then I think that might backfire.
Yeah, well, I think there's already a perception. I don't know if you guys listened to Kim Hill interview English yesterday, but there is already a perception that National are being petulant,
Right.
and that basically they had Labor over a barrel over the select committee stuff, although when they were still in government they were more than happy to reduce those numbers. Now that they're in opposition, they're suddenly vehemently opposed to it, and English is saying it's because they were doing their best to accommodate Labor at the time. Well, it's not often that you see a government wanting to be so accommodating of the opposition in that regard. So I think a lot of people will see it for what it was.
And yet, on the other hand, I sort of feel as though there's a danger with some partisans that have been cross with National Party. What do they think they're doing opposing the government?
It's in the name.
Because it's kind of the clue is in the name.
They did it. They did their job yesterday as the they did what was best for the opposition yesterday. That it was a genius move, really, when you look at it from that point of view. But I think a lot of people will be irritated by it.
I don't think many people will remember this in 3 years' time when we go back to the polls. I don't think many people will remember this. No. Once parliamentary question time starts.
Okay, well that's good. No one cares. We've covered that. The other thing that happened in a big day for politics, New Zealand yesterday. You right? What's up?
No, I just realised it was totally wrong. No, it was because English had said that that they were going to do everything they could to thwart the government and the select committees. That Labor then, moved to reduce retaliated through the numbers. Sorry, that was a little maternal hormones moment. I've been having a few of them
okay because we've established that no one cares anyway. But
that's
anyway,
right.
So
and it was all a bit of shadow boxing anyway, because the proportionality actually stays exactly the same no matter what the numbers are. So National didn't gain or lose a majority on select committees as a result.
Let's talk about Winston Peters, who also yesterday made himself front and centre of the news, despite, I guess, being on an aeroplane to Vietnam at the time, in that papers were served on 9 individuals, including MPs, among them Bill English and Paula Bennett, and who's the MSD CEO? That
Brendan Boyle.
That guy. And Clark Hennessy, the National Party staffer, who Winston Peters in these papers believes to be the prime suspect, which is strongly denied by Clark Hennessy and others.
Former Paula Bennett staffer.
Former Paula Bennett staffer, Clark Hennessy also. And also on Tim Murphy, the founder and editor of the Newsroom website, and Lloyd Burr, political reporter at News Hub.
I'm interested. Why Lloyd Burr, though? Because it was actually Jenna Lynch that took
the call?
That took the original phone call.
Right. I mean, I think that it must be because, Lloyd Burr was the one who made the call to Winston Peters to put the allegations to him. And then one thing that hasn't been mentioned in all this is that actually the story was broken by Winston Peters, because I remember he put out the press release. I remember because there'd been all this talk, and there'd been the Tim Murphy mother of all scandals. What we're talking about for people who aren't familiar is the story that broke a couple of weeks out from the election. It was shortly after the National Party campaign launch, at which, according to Winston Peters, Stephen Joyce was heard to say, can't remember the words, but that there was some big story coming on Winston Peters. I was at that conference, I did hear talk about there being a story about Winston Peters, not directly from National Party people, but from among the press pack. And the story, it turned out, was that Winston Peters, presumably unbeknownst to him, had been receiving more superannuation than he was entitled to, owing to an error that had been made on a form. He, of course, had paid that back quickly, blah, blah, blah. But Winston Peters very cross about the story getting out, and it seemed to have something to do with the no surprises rule. And there were various people that knew, including Paula Bennett and Wayne Eagleson and Anne Tolley, Wayne Eagleson being the chief of staff.
They've also been served, eh?
Yeah, I think so.
Tolley and Bennett.
Yeah. And Peters got very cross about this and felt that it was politically motivated, and so now he's served these papers seeking discovery so that he can work out who he's going to take action again. Was it under a privacy
breach of privacy
tort,
privacy, I think.
Presumably, yeah. So that, I don't know. I mean, our view. Oh, I should mention just as an aside that the first wind we got of this was when someone turned up in the spin-off office looking for Tim Murphy with papers. We realised later they had papers to serve, making the mistake that Tim Murphy worked for a different exciting media startup to the one that he in fact does. Where am I going? Is Winston Peters doing his government any favours by taking this course of action? I mean, I
don't think it'll hurt them.
There's two questions. The first is, does Winston have a point? Mm-hmm. And he absolutely does. Mm. His personal information, which was that he had been overpaid superannuation, was disclosed by the Ministry of Social Development to their minister, Anne Tolley, which they had no reason to do, because that is not a minister. That's a completely operational thing, and matter involving somebody's personal details. The minister has no right to know that kind of thing. And then the Ministry of Social Development, when they were seeking advice about whether they should tell Anne Tolley, their minister, this under the so-called no surprises rule, they consulted with the State Services Commission, which is meant to be the kind of bulwark or guardian of the public service against political interference, essentially. And when the State Services Commission said, yeah, you probably should be on the safe side and tell her, they decided that under the no surprises rule, they should probably tell their minister, Paula Bennett, that. So this organisation, which is meant to be the most neutral civil service organisation, ended up being basically an informant network for one of the most political, ministers in the government, Paula Bennett, and basically she herself described it as good gossip and said that she wouldn't share it on that basis. But there's no reason for senior civil servants like Peter Hughes at the State Services Commissioner to be gossiping with their political masters about information that they shouldn't even know about individuals' payment records.
And English said at the time too, didn't he, that information shouldn't have been shared with the ministers.
He was very quick to condemn. So Winston is right to want answers about this. Where I think he might be on the wrong track is pursuing this as a private individual and going after these people, as Winston Raymond Peters, private citizen, through the courts. What a better course of action probably for the country would be is to get Peter Hughes in as the State Services Commissioner and tell him he needs to radically reevaluate his approach to the no surprises policy, and then he needs to disseminate that reevaluation throughout the civil service so that the civil service aren't being used as a Five Eyes network for the government of the day, and that they're not there just to narc on people to their ministers. And there, and hopefully we'll see some action on this from the current government. In the coalition agreement with the Greens, they talk about introducing more transparency, improving OIA processes, and this is all part of restoring a bit of independence to the public service and getting them away from just being henchmen to politicians.
Do you think that won't be happening anyway?
There hasn't been any kind of announcement about it that I'm aware of. I hope that it's happening.
The serving papers on the media as well, isn't that a bit chilling? I mean, I found that a bit troubling that you just sort of kind of serving for the Deputy Prime Minister. Admittedly, the papers were issued before the election, 2 days before the election, but the very sight of the Deputy Prime Minister demanding that media reveal their sources seems to me pretty distasteful and chilling.
Yeah, it's always concerning when you have, politicians sort of putting pressure on journalists. But having said that, I think at the time, I made the criticism that as a journalist, it's not in my own opinion, it's not just enough to accept sources at face value and run the information they have, even if you can verify that it's true. I think you have an obligation to really understand what the motivations of those sources are, and I'm not sure if there was enough probing by the journalists before they ran the story as to why that information was getting leaked and and for what reason. And that's concerning.
But Winston broke the story.
He broke it because he knew that they were going to run it. The tweet, mother of all tweets, was the mother of all scandals was already out there. So he knew that its release was imminent, and he chose to spoil it, which may come back to hurt him in terms of the, this case, because ultimately he was the one that really put it out there in the public, in public. So. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how this one plays out. But can I just say how right I was when on election night I said that this will have an effect on who Winston chooses to form a coalition with. And while I absolutely believe that had there been no other choice, of course he would have formed a government with National, I absolutely believe that it would have totally tainted his relationship with National, and if there was any way that he was going to be able to form a coalition with Labour, then he would, because it's pretty serious what went down to have your such private information leaked like that in the middle of an election campaign to such a major news outlet is pretty dirty stuff.
And Winston Peters is clearly determined or pretty sure in his own mind that the leak has been politically motivated and come from someone in the National Party. Do you think that's right, Ben, that in a way that makes the whole process of negotiation look different, knowing that he was in a position where surely he wasn't about to serve papers on the Prime Minister if he was Deputy Prime Minister, Does that change the complexion of all of that?
No, I mean, you always set up to keep your options open. When he sort of filed these papers, he's always got the option to not serve them. Yeah. So I don't think that it does show that everything was predetermined. It could certainly show that he was weighted one way or the other, but certainly no predestination there. I think it's interesting. Australia had a sort of similar situation recently where a minister's office tipped off journalists about a raid on a union headquarters, and then the minister in question denied leaking the information about the raid so that journalists could be there to see it and take shots and things. And then I think BuzzFeed ran a story quoting two journalistic sources anonymously, saying actually the tip-off did come from the minister's office. And there the question became, actually what we're doing is not revealing sources, what we're doing is catching a minister out in a lie when they deny the leak. Yeah. Now, if you saw a similar sort of thing happen here, you'd say maybe there is some sort of value in that. At the same time, we shouldn't be getting into an area where courts are compelling journalists to release their sources. But I think, like Annabelle was talking about, I think journalists will sometimes become a bit more critical if they see, for instance, sources directly contradicting, what they know is the case, in terms of a disclosure.
Let's talk briefly before we go about the National Party opposition and the reshuffle there, this supposed monster opposition. Ben, the reshuffle was pretty small. There wasn't much change. There were a few promotions. Judith Collins moved about, and Tolly moved to Assistant Speaker. I put it to you, sir, that this is precisely the reshuffle you might introduce if you were planning quietly in the back of your mind to quit as leader in 6 months' time.
I don't think that necessarily follows. It might be, as a lot of National Party proxies have been sort of saying in the media, it might be the kind of government, the kind of lineup you'd have if you thought that you were going to reassume government in anywhere from 6 months to 3 years. You know, I know that some people.
Why would you do that?
I know that some people in National believe that there may be a change of government
in 6 months
without an election. I don't think it's likely, but people have discussed that. So
sorry, just briefly, what's that scenario? Is that a waka jumping scenario?
That's a waka jumping scenario.
Okay.
Now, whether it's realistic or not, I know that it's something that's discussed, right? So if it's
what do you reckon, Annabelle? Just briefly on that. Plausible?
I don't think so.
Because you were right on election night. I've just got a note down here. Annabelle, right.
Right, again.
That
was two correct things that I said.
Yeah. Because the last podcast we were talking about Ben being wrong about
so many
his
things.
prediction about which way.
And that, yeah.
Anyway, sorry, you were saying?
It's also the sort of lineup you might have if you didn't think you did anything wrong during your time in government,
right,
and that the public just needs to come to its senses, which unfortunately for the National Party is actually quite a prevalent attitude right now.
Right.
And that's the sort of attitude which sees you leaving Jonathan Coleman in health, which he somehow managed to turn from the safest portfolio in National under Tony Ryle into a debacle during the election in only 3 years. It's this sort of idea, there has been this idea floated that because there's so many former ministers who know government inside and out, to quote one political columnist, that they'll be able to really give the new government ministers the runaround at question time. I'm a bit leery of that. I think that if you didn't get to grips with your portfolio over 3 to 9 years, you're not going to suddenly become a quick study over the summer break.
Yeah. The only one beyond the pale was Nick Smith, who hasn't been reappointed to a housing portfolio, right?
Yeah, that's right. That was the only significant sort of demotion, or removal of responsibilities. That's the only one where you could sort of say, yeah, we think we were on the wrong track there. Whereas you could pick a lot of previous ministers who really didn't impress in their portfolios, who didn't bring a lot to the table, and who were just their rubber stamping officials. And this seems like a little bit of I think it's too early to do big kind of reshuffles because they did get 44%, right? So there wasn't a huge amount of unhappiness with their performance out in the electorate at large. So you wouldn't sort of go crazy, but I think it is a bit bizarre that they didn't take time for a bit of weeding. There were certainly some good promotions. Guys like Jonathan Young got Energy and Resources. He's in Taranaki, so that's pretty apt. Chris Bishop got Police. That's a very active opposition portfolio. Scott Simpson got Environment. That's a bit of a bump up for him. And Todd Muller got Crown Māori Relationship and Climate Change, which is a big promotion responsibilities for a reasonably unknown backbencher about 3 years ago.
What did you make of it all, Annabelle? Did you expect to see a bigger reshuffle on the main opposition party?
I personally thought one of the things that was interesting in the divvy up of the ministerial portfolios was the treaty negotiations minister, and I note that in a couple of interviews, Calvin Davis has said that the advice they received was that it wouldn't be appropriate for a Māori to hold that position because it could potentially be a conflict of interest, and even if there's not a real conflict of interest, a perceived conflict of interest is, is a problem also. And I thought about that for a couple of days, and I have to say that, given that the treaty was signed by both Māori and Pākehā, if you were to sort of follow that argument, would it then not also be a conflict of interest for a Pākehā to hold that position? I think that it's a bit of a slippery slope, and while I totally realise that Calvin does have some real conflicts of interest in terms of the Ngāpuhi settlement, I think to have such a blanket approach and that all Māori would be unable to hold that position is a somewhat concerning one.
Well, all ministers of the Crown would have conflict, in effect, being ministers of the Crown. But is it not also partly because Kelvin Doe's is Ngāpuhi, isn't he? So isn't that
yes,
part
that's
of
right.
it? And
yeah.
I would be amazed.
Absolutely. So I get why Kelvin himself couldn't hold that position, but to say that a Māori could not, which is, I just checked the interviews again.
Did he say that? Right.
That's what's been reported. That's concerning because, someone like perhaps Ron Mark, with the exception of the Kahungunu settlement, I don't see why he would have a massive conflict of interest holding that position, or others, Kiritapu Allen, say, who's been a treaty lawyer herself. So, I just think it's an interesting argument there.
I think if that is the advice Kelvin received, it sounds a bit crazy to me, and I think they would definitely want to get a second set of eyes on that. If that was the opinion of the Cabinet Office, it certainly doesn't sound right to me. I mean, the issue that you get with being of Māori descent is if you have any lineage or descent from the named parties in a treaty settlement, then you are a beneficiary. It's kind of like the Barnaby Joyce situation in Australia. Whether you want to be or not, you're a named beneficiary. So there you do basically have a legal conflict if you'd be negotiating a settlement, for an iwi that you have lineage.
You could renounce your Māoriness. You'd be available. That.
And so I mean, obviously, yeah. So, and for that reason, when Chris Finlayson was Treaty Settlements Minister, because of course he had worked for Ngāi Tahu during their settlement negotiations. So anything that involved revisiting their settlement and the issues around that, he would always delegate to another minister, and that would be the same sort of situation you'd have if somebody like Kelvin became Treaty Minister and was working on a Ngāpuhi settlement. Now that's such a big part of that portfolio right now. They may have just thought, well, that kind of rules him out, sort of, from contention.
Let's wrap it up. We're now nearly 3 weeks, I think 20 days as we speak, since Winston Peters chose, out of the two sort of jars in front of him, chose the red one. And how has it gone so far? The Ardern government, give us a mark out of 10 or out of 11.7 billion or whatever you like. Ben Thomas, how do you rate the performance of the government so far?
I think 109 select committee slots out of 120. I think they've done well. Look, where they've come in for criticism has been some pretty minor house management stuff, which I don't think is a big problem. They've gotten off the block really quickly in terms of implementing manifesto promises, in terms of extending parental leave. Jacinda Ardern, rhetorically at least, has been a lot stronger in the foreign policy space than we saw our previous government being. She's sort of been a lot more assertive in terms of things like New Zealanders' rights in Australia and Manus Island. I think it's a pretty strong performance.
So you're giving it, there was sort of an 8.5, something.
I think it worked out as about, almost a 9.
Almost a 9. Annabelle Lee.
Yeah, I give them a 9. I think it's been a really strong start, and I think a lot of women like me will be happy to see the paid maternity leave being extended. I think it's a really great thing to spend our money on if we're serious about supporting tamariki and their whānau. But points off for yesterday, and points off for, is it diplomatic security, for not doing a good enough job protecting paddles.
Paddles. I agree with the group. That's the end of the Paddlecast. We're devoting this to paddles and dead cats everywhere.
The memory of paddles.
Kia ora, I'm Alex Casey, Senior Writer at The Spinoff. We wouldn't exist without the ongoing support of our generous members. If you're able to, you can make a donation at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, Podcast Manager at The Spinoff. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.